Mhm.
And we are live.
Hi, my name is Noel McDermott, psychotherapist. Welcome to the Wellbeing show. And on this evening's show, I have a great guy, Andy Leach, who's over in Thailand at the moment. Hello, Andy.
Good evening or good morning.
I was going to say, so what ridiculous time is it over there?
It's 3 o'clock in the morning, so I'm a little bit sort of bamboozled, really.
I haven't seen 3 o'clock in the morning since I was in my 20s, which was a very long time ago. And I was doing things that kept me awake, various sort of nefarious activities I was involved in my 20s. But now I'm in my 50s. But well done for making it. It's really good to have you here. Thanks, Andy. Andy's a psychotherapist and also has a clinical lead for an organisation called The Cabin, which are a series of addiction treatment and rehabilitation services over in Thailand and in Australia. And where else are you? Your connections with Europe?
Hong Kong and Singapore. So
Right.
basically primarily Asia. We have sort of representatives in Europe, but primarily Asia.
And I've been to, you're based in Chiang Mai, I think, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah, I've been to Chiang Mai. I visited your facility in Chiang Mai. I think it was last year. It's very beautiful.
The new one, the one that we built?
Yeah, the big town that you've built. Not really.
So a series of villages, yes.
Series of villages that turn into. Yeah, it's a beautiful place. Really beautiful.
Thank you. Yes.
I went down there. There was a guy, and Gary, who was previously one of the singing managers there. So
that's right. Yeah.
Very kindly invited me out, and I then did this bonkers thing. I don't know why I did it now. On reflection, it's that, you know, when you get into that zone in your work and sort of blinkered. I said, yeah, I'd love to come out, and I decided to fly out for a weekend. Why on earth would anybody fly to Chiang Mai for a weekend? I have no idea why I did it. It was a sort of wasted opportunity. I should have stayed for a week or two and sort of visited your facility and then sort of gone off. But I didn't. I thought I'll be, you know, in and out and sort of crazy.
Well,
but beautiful.
I will. Come back for longer. When flights reopen.
Which hopefully will be soon. How are things out in Thailand in terms of the coronavirus, etc.?
Well, actually, pretty good on the whole. So there's been not that many cases at all in Thailand, and deaths are in the double digits only. Yeah. So it's been contained actually fabulously well. I think what happened in Asia a lot, because I think perhaps because of the proximity to China, everyone sort of was fairly quick off the mark. So it was pretty immediate that sort of flights were cancelled. There was no incoming flights to Thailand. The population all sort of took to it. Sort of everyone sort of did the lockdown sort of completely by the book, and even now everyone still wears masks. Mask wearing was in the culture already. So if you're ill, you wear a mask to stop you passing it on to someone else, which is I thought when I moved out here, it was always a nice gesture of like, oh, okay, so it's not about protecting yourself, it's about protecting others. So that was already in the culture. So perhaps that played a part in it not spreading very far. And lockdown was partial. So I could still drive to work. Work, we managed to stay open, but with the Ministry of Health's approval, because we had everything in place. We tested every single person that came on site. Only essential workers had contact with the clients. The clients had social distancing in place. So we managed to sort of keep going.
Good news. Good news.
Yeah.
And the death toll has been low. I mean, that's the thing that we watch, isn't it? Sort of thank God for that. It's, you know, not affected so many people and saying something. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to do a bit of what they call furniture moving on the show, which is I'm going to tell people how they can get hold of us. We're live streaming. We always live stream the show, which is why Andy's on at a ridiculous time in the morning over in Thailand, because we sort of enjoy the fact that it's live and we can get interaction from people. So we're on sort of several platforms at the moment. Hopefully, if it's working tonight, we should be on LinkedIn, Facebook Live, YouTube, and also on Twitter via Periscope. So there's a whole bunch of platforms which people should be able to reach out to us on. What will happen is that periodically I'll have a look at these platforms to see if anybody's made any comments. So I'll just stop the show and say, right, I'm going to check out LinkedIn now and stuff like that. But also another way that you can get hold of us, and it'd be lovely to hear from you if you did, is if you gave me a call. You can call me on my mobile, which is 07506 319 745. That's +44 7506 319 745. I'm hoping that my team on the various platforms will put those contact details out there so that you can get hold of us and you can give us a call. It'd be lovely to hear from you. And if you've got questions for myself, boring. I'm here every week. I don't know why you'd want to ask me questions, but particularly if you've got questions for Andy, give us a call. Andy's going to has a long and really interesting both personal and professional history, which we're going to hear a lot about this evening. And his expertise is in addiction recovery. He's been in the field a long time. How did you get into the field? What was your journey into this field, Andy?
Well, it was.
Do you prefer Andy or Andrew? Because you got your name up as Andrew, but you prefer.
Oh,
Andy.
have I? Oh, yes, I'm Andy. I'm an Andy.
All right, good.
Yeah. How did I get into the field? So, well, I suppose through my own personal journey of recovery.
Okay.
I got
people
clean.
That don't know, I'm not going to assume anything here, but for people that don't know, what do you mean by recovery? It's a term that's used a lot in particularly addiction world. It's used more and more now in mental health as well. But what do you mean by recovery?
Well, what I mean by it is that literally it's a bit like sort of black and white, really, in many respects. So I had a completely different life prior to 1999 when I went into a treatment centre for addiction. Addiction in many forms to many different things, and my recovery, what I qualify as recovery, is being completely drug and alcohol free, working a program of recovery which props up my lifestyle of abstinence, yes, recovering myself in many different ways. So recovering myself physically. I mean, I was nearly dead when I came into recovery. I was sort of 7 stone, I think, 7.5 stone. I was very, very skinny, very unwell, not eating, and then recovering myself emotionally, on an emotional basis, actually getting back in touch with myself and who I am and my feelings mentally. I was not in my right mind. I'd been through drug-induced psychosis 10 years before that, and I think that had stayed with me for quite some time. I was really a very, very scared individual, extremely anxious from a very young age, but living in fear most of my life until the age of 36 when I came into recovery. And the other component was recovery in terms of a spiritual life. So when I came into this treatment center in 1999, I was dead inside. There was nothing. It was what we refer to for people who are in recovery as a complete rock bottom on all those different levels. So to be in recovery is to recover all those areas of self, really. And I continue to do that. I continue to do that 20 years on, 20 plus years on.
Will you ever be recovered, do you think? Just interesting. Recovery is a verb, isn't it, rather than a noun? It's not a
yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I still go to 12-step meetings. That maintains my recovery. And there are people who say, I am a recovered addict, or I am a recovered alcoholic. And I find that baffling, because for me, it is this the old adage of it's a one day at a time. On any given day, I can be more closer to a sort of full biopsychosocial, biological, emotional, spiritual sense of recovery than another day. Another day, I can be much closer to that sort of rock bottom. I'm not like I was when I came in 20 odd years ago, but I suppose what I'm saying is, I have to work this daily. I have to work it daily, and each day there's an opportunity for growth, or there's an opportunity for stagnation. I suppose that's what I'm saying.
Isn't that just like sensible advice for life? That's sort of
quite possibly,
just keep engaging in your own personal growth on a daily basis.
Absolutely. I mean, recently I've been, particularly during the COVID crisis, I've been thinking very much about how my recovery has helped in terms of my resilience, and how actually the 12 steps, which are, as I say, the foundation of my recovery, is something that would be useful for everyone. And through working those and getting to know myself better and having this sense of connection with others, which is what that brings me, I feel much more resilient through COVID. I feel very able to cope. And I've been looking at other people thinking, God, this is something that really, the vast majority of people could benefit from.
Sure. So biopsychosocial. Let's deconstruct that a little bit, those interesting terms. And that's very much, I know, in the treatment field. Those are terms that come from the treatment field. What do you mean by those in terms of thinking about treatment and recovery within addiction? And I presume, let's just think about addiction as well. I mean, I'm presuming you're using addiction to mean a whole range of possible behaviours, that not just what people might narrowly think of as addiction, which is involving needles and heroin. People have that image, but addiction can be much broader than that, which would include, I guess, alcohol for you and food. Let's define some of those terms a little bit.
Okay, so there's biopsychosocial. So again, it's sort of what I was really describing about those four areas of the rock bottom, the sort of biological, psychological, social areas of my life which were compromised by addiction. So when I do an assessment for a client to come into our treatment centre, those would be the areas that I'm looking at. I'm looking at how it's affecting them physically, whether physical illness has been precipitated by the addiction, whether there's any mental illness, any what we call comorbidity, so any underlying mental health issues that have appeared, or alongside, or even were there before the addiction. So so it can be a mixture of both, basically. Biopsycho and social, about how this has affected people in their lives. So in terms of their relationships. So, and that will be looking at family of origin, nuclear family, wives, children, because this illness of addiction, which I think I believe this is an illness, I believe it's a disease, affects every single area of one's life, but it also affects all the people around you. So that's that. And the second part of your question was about alcohol, and
Well, it was about what you mean by addiction. Is addiction a specific thing, or is it a range of things? How do you understand it?
So yes, I believe so. I mean, I believe that addiction is a disease. It's a disease of brain reward. So it's to do with brain reward, motivation, and memory. So it's to do with how how we feel rewarded. So my own personal experience, maybe if I personalize it, make it clearer. As a young child, I craved sugar. I could never get enough sugar. I stole from my mother's handbag to get money to go and buy more sweets. I would steal from the local shop to get more sweets. I would hoard sweets. We had a sweetie jar up in the kitchen, and I was obsessed with this sweetie jar. The way I would eat my sweets was very sort of obsessive as well. I would sort of line them up in a row, and I'd sort of eat them. I'd have particular sort of rituals around eating them. And I look back on that, I think that was exactly how I was with my substances of choice later on in life. Now, what I was doing at the time, I believe, was there was part of me that didn't feel rewarded. I didn't feel. So after lunch, Mum would give us all a sweet, but that wasn't enough. It just wasn't enough for me. So I wanted more, and I had to have more. And I don't know, but to me, that felt like it was to do with my reward system in my brain. And I can go into that if you like.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm aware of the evidence that the D2 receptors are damaged.
Yes.
And the D2 receptors are about dopamine, and dopamine levels are motivators, if you like, the motivation to the go, not go bit of our brain, if you like.
Exactly.
Yeah. Talk more about that.
Yes, and as those are damaged, or perhaps what they don't allow you to receive as much dopamine as perhaps your average Joe. What happens is you work harder to raise your overall hedonic tone, so your ability to experience pleasure. Yeah. And so I was working harder by going and stealing money from my mum to go and get this sugar. Sure. And because I wanted more sugar, and to try and get myself to this point where my hedonic tone raises, where I feel okay in myself, I feel rewarded and at peace. But it was never enough. So what happens is, by constantly doing that, what I was doing was spiking my dopamine levels, and then they drop, spiking, drop. So the overall hedonic tone just lowers. So my ability to experience pleasure in life actually was blunted. So therefore I progressed to cigarettes, marijuana, and so on. And it progressed.
So that's that notion of polyaddiction and cross addiction. That an addict will journey from one substance or process to another, trying to get those levels up to feel sort of normal, as it were. I've got my phone doing something. Really, stay with me. Sorry, live show.
Okay.
I thought I'd turned it off, but.
But Noel is completely right. It's I progressed through that sort of the poly substances. I was a sort of classic addict in many respects. And by 18, I was at university in Bristol, and I tried heroin by that.
So some people, sorry, here we go again. I thought I'd turn this thing off, but clearly not. There you go, the joys of working from home and doing a live show. We try and sort everything out, but there you go. My control sort of freakiness hasn't worked this evening. Such is life. We'll see if there are any more beeps in the meantime, or any deliveries. which has happened on one show. I had a delivery once, which was interesting during lockdown.
Ooh, pizza.
Yeah, no, it wasn't. It was, I forget what it was. It was something else. So poor delivery people, though, have been working till late over here in the UK. We love them. Well done, folks, keeping us going. So we're talking about this sort of transition, this movement through various substances and processes. And sugar is a substance, but also food is a process addiction. And sort of thinking about the sort of links and differences between those. Did you come from, I don't know what that is, excuse me, 1 second.
No worries. So, I mean, yes, the difference between processes, and many people seem that I've worked with are unaware that they think that it's about a substance that you ingest. So, oh yes, that particular drug is very addictive or whatever. But actually, if we think about it, that it's something that's going on in our brain, in the reward system, then actually a process can be equally as addictive. And that process may be overeating, it might be gambling. What we're seeing recently, of course, is gaming. And so we have many people coming to us at the cabin for gaming addiction. So what else might it be? Sex addiction. Many people will say, well, you know, sex addictive? Well, actually, yes, I've worked with people who their sex addiction is absolutely chronic. It's devastating. It destroys lives, destroys families, breaks them up, and people cannot stop. And they're literally obsessed and sort of in the compulsion where they just cannot stop doing what they're doing, and they at the point where they know it's destructive and destroying their lives, but they still cannot stop.
And that's all coming down to these sort of underlying neurological systems that are in place. So would you see addiction as something that's primarily then inherited in that sense, or is it something? I'm just thinking about how you grew up, because I've sort of, having done a research call with you. I'm sorry about this phone. It's I keep turning it off and it turns itself on and starts beeping. So not a lot I can do about that. Maybe throw it out the window soon.
Yeah,
there you go. Not too worried about it. But sort of thinking about addiction and trying to sort of define it and understand it. So give people who are listening a sense of it. And one of the things I really like the fact that you know from the inside as well as somebody who would self-identify as an addict in recovery. And it's something I would self-identify as well with, but also you've got some education around it, which is really interesting. So thinking about what addiction is, because I think there's a lot of confusion about it, because people mistake it for the behavior. So an addict is somebody who's a heroin addict or an alcoholic, or it's the substance that gets obsessed about, as opposed to thinking about the human being and what's going on for them and what's happening for them.
Yes. So I think really you're asking me about the sort of etiology of it. So is this nature? Is this nurture?
Yeah.
Is this yes. Was I born an addict? Honestly, I don't know. What I do know is that the vast majority of people that I work with have some level of trauma.
Okay.
So there's that, and that when I say trauma, I don't mean PTSD. I don't mean your classic sort of I've been in a war zone trauma.
Yeah.
I mean possibly developmental trauma, which can lead to sort of attachment disorders or whatever, or also there is a genetic component as well. So it can be a mixture of both. I mean, when I run a group of addicts, and I teach them about the disease of addiction and what it is, and I ask people, is there addiction in your family? And you'll usually find with a group of addicts in a treatment centre, usually about 90% of people put their hands up and say that it's in their family. So within my own family, I have a cousin who's in recovery. I had a grandfather who definitely had some sort of mental illness, but our family didn't really talk about that sort of stuff. It was a bit swept under the carpet. Possibly an anxiety disorder, I don't know. Yeah, there's something in my family, so there's a genetic component.
It's also interesting, I think, to note that trauma itself can be inherited in some ways, because it can be passed on through the amygdala from generation to generation.
Transgenerational trauma.
Yeah.
I've worked with clients whose grandparents were survivors of the Holocaust.
Right.
And it's unbelievable, because I remember. Yeah, I don't want to identify and make anyone identifiable in any way, but it's interesting where you can actually feel that trauma in the human being 2 generations on, because there's nothing in their own lives as such that sort of, but you can definitely sense this sort of, it's like a shadow that's sort of been passed down through the generations.
And it's more than just learned behaviour as well, in my experience. It's actually then people are responding, and there are sort of certain types of life events that your parents or your grandparents might have had that you know nothing about, but you hit those times, the same age that it happened to your grandmother or something, and you start to go through some difficult times. And often that's what we do. I mean, that's why as a therapist, that's why I get a good personal history and family history from people, and we do a genogram looking at sort of the intergenerational stuff, and so to help people understand things, not really as that sort of Freudian stuff of I want to regress you to stuff, just for information really, and arming people. What do you think of the idea that addiction might be a survival strategy from trauma? Because I've seen some people argue, for example, that in terms of intergenerational trauma, you can find the person who started it, and then you can draw a sort of triangle down several generations, and people inside that triangle from the originator of the trauma, not triangle, diamond shape, not triangle. And people inside that are more likely to either have depressive suicidality or addiction. And addiction is a sort of an adaptation which is a better survival adaptation than the depressive suicidality, obviously. Addiction is about obsessing about trying to stay alive in some ways. You can sort of think about it. Have you come across that idea and sort of wonder what you think about it?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, I think really you're sort of talking about addiction as sort of like a survival skill in some ways.
Well, I'm thinking about the underlying neurological substrate. So if you, things like, for example, cocaine uses the same neural pathways as sex, and that sort of thing. And we're discovering more and more about the actual neural pathways that these processes and substances hijack seem to be around species level survival things, like even though on the surface they appear quite mad, and they can appear quite mad and anti sort of life, but there is a survival element to them.
Absolutely. Well, as you mentioned earlier about the amygdala, I mean, it's in the sort of fight or flight mechanism of the brain. So it's sort of what's happening is addiction ends up sort of in that part of the brain where it becomes the most important thing in one's life. It sort of takes over. If we think of sort of a hierarchy of needs, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you have family, food, water, whatever it is that you need to survive, addiction eventually goes up and up and up to the point where it's at the top of this hierarchy of needs and is the most important thing. So if I take you back to the rock bottom that I had, where I wasn't eating, I was completely cut off from family, friends, not working, living in a car in London. The most important thing to me at that point in my life was to get the next hit. So it absolutely was about the hierarchy of needs, and it was about what was going on in my brain, about how the neural pathways were telling me you need this to survive. That was so a lot of the work that we now do, that we do with people in recovery, is to create new neural pathways, to create new ways of people learning how to be rewarded. And you have to go through a period of feeling extremely flat for quite some time, which I personally did, to actually be able to learn long-term recovery in terms of rerouting the brain in many respects. But I think also, interestingly, in terms of trauma and resilience, you're right, sort of addiction is sort of self-medication on many levels. So what we're doing is we're medicating something in ourselves, whether that is the lack of dopamine, but also about whether it's something that is emotionally painful, psychologically painful, and we don't have the skills to cope with that from a very early age. So therefore we look for different types of coping skills. So we learn, again, resilience. So many of the clients that come to us are incredibly resilient. So they're not victims in many ways. That's what we teach them. So you're not a victim. Actually, you've got amazing survival skills. You have survived really what's like a sort of personal war zone in many ways. And that's to be applauded. But ultimately, the ways that you have learned to cope and those coping skills don't work anymore. So we need to show you some new ones. So, yeah.
Would you have been predictable from the way you were brought up, do you think? Would you have predicted, if we were to sort of unpack that story, that you would have ended up in a car as an addict with nothing else and essentially killing yourself and destroying yourself? Do you think that would have been predictable from your early years? Because I suppose people have in their minds this idea that all addicts come from a certain type of background, which is highly dysfunctional and damaging and etc. Is that your story as well?
No, I'd say no. You couldn't have predicted it in many ways. No, I have a brother, sister. My brother, we went through the same schools. He went on to join the army and ended up in the city and had a very traditional British life. House in the country with sort of four-wheel drives and children and a nanny. That wasn't my story, and my sister similar, but I think maybe I was the youngest. I think that I don't know if that had part to play with it in any way, but I know that from a very early age I definitely was always looking for ways to fix myself. I think as I say, my brother went to the same schools as me, but I went to boarding school at 7 years old.
Right.
Now, I look back on that now, and I just think, well, that was I was taken away from a very nurturing. My family was, it was a happy family. There's no one to blame there. There was no one who was abusive or anything like that. My father was ex-army and bit of an authoritative figure, but he was a kind man, and so there was nothing really particularly bad nothing particularly dysfunctional in the family home. But I think the main thing was that I went to boarding school at 7, and I remember coming home and I feel quite emotional telling you about it. But coming home and sort of going to go and give my dad a kiss goodnight, him going, "No, you're grown up now. We don't do that." And that was at sort of just 7 or 8 years old, So that level of sort of intimacy, was cut off from me at a very young age. Really, at 7 years old, you're sent to go and sort of fend for yourself in this environment that was sort of cold baths and it was quite austere. So,
well, I mean, there is a syndrome associated with boarding schools,
absolutely.
it can be quite a challenging experience. I mean, I don't want to put boarding schools down. I work with quite a few, and they work very hard to create now sort of a much better emotionally holding environment. But you and I are of an age, I think, sort of, certainly boarding schools when you were 7 probably had very little insight into those types of issues. I felt quite sad. I felt quite touched by that story about your father saying, no, you're too old to kiss, because I have a stepson, Matteo, who's 10, and my God, he has to fight me off from kissing him, to be honest. Poor thing. I embarrass him. I mean, sort of, the way the world changes, I guess, in some ways, is what I'm talking about. So.
Absolutely. And interestingly, if I look back on that what it was called prep school, most of the masters had either been in the war or in the Second World War, or were sort of unable to go. So they were either sort of resentful that they hadn't been able to fight, or they were damaged and traumatized individuals themselves. One of the headmasters, there were 2 headmasters, and one of them, they were brothers. One of them had I don't know if it was a wooden leg, but it was a sort of leg, and that was sort of like metal, I think, and you'd hear it clanking down the corridors, and it was always sort of, and all the boys knew that this was an injury he'd got in the Second World War. And so that sense of like the trauma of the Second World War was in the school.
Yeah.
So I think it isn't just intergenerational familial trauma. I think it also, it's in our culture, in our society as well. Some people.
Yeah, and a lot of, as people with PTSD can have quite odd functioning at times. It's not a judgment, it's the truth. And I think in many of those soldiers who came back, the expectation was that they would get back to normal life. And of course they didn't. They barely functioned, a lot of them. And if they did function, they functioned in very odd ways, because at that time there weren't the treatments available. We were beginning to understand PTSD at that time. There were sort of, in the British Army in particular, there were some sort of leading lights who were moving away from shell shock as a notion, but the psychological technology wasn't there at the time, so I remember the military hospital in Birmingham, for example, was the first one that coined the term art therapy, which they started using in the King's Norton Hospital, where art therapy, but that was considered revolutionary at the time. Certainly didn't have the types of services that we have now: cognitive behavioural therapy, EMDR, lifespan integration, etc., internal family systems, and so on. We've come a long way in terms of. So I guess I'm getting a sense of this little boy amongst all these sort of father figures who themselves were a little bit broken and not quite sure how to relate. And that's, when was that? What sort of years were we talking about? What, 1990? No, 19...
So 1970, I suppose.
Yeah.
So I would have left home to go to a prep school in 1970.
So I'm just thinking of the time, and again contextualizing it. So concepts of maleness and manhood were also very different in those days, even without the impact of sort of the war and possible trauma, etc., etc. There was, a sense of what it was to be a man. Can you remember those times? What it's like? I distinctly remember, because I was born 1967, so the 70s I was at school as well, and the 70s was the big transition in terms of gender roles and concepts of gender roles. Can you remember back to those times, what it was like, what the expectations were?
Oh, very much so. I mean, well, particularly the sort of British public school system as well. Sure. So there was a sense of sort of like you're sort of part of some elite, you're sort of entitled as well. So there was that in the mix as well. But sort of
which is quite a lot of pressure on kids. That's a lot of pressure to put on. I mean, the kids I work with are at boarding schools, etc., Harrow and so on. You know, there's yes, it is entitlement is one side of it, but the crushing pressure to conform and be part of an elite is a real challenge.
Absolutely. So it was, and I think even as quite early on, I had a sort of sense of, you know, of like, this is very strange. It feels quite insular, and this need to conform.
Yeah.
I started to rebel, I'd say, probably when I was about 13, 14, but I think that had started much earlier. And so I'd watched everything around me and thought, I don't know if I agree with all of this, really.
Right.
It just feels so like a sort of gilded cage in some ways. You know, that's what it felt like. And that sense of masculinity, I mean, it's odd because really I had very little feminine contact from the age of 7, because I mean, I think there were matrons, but mainly just in a completely all male environment. And when I went to the next school I went to at 12 or 13, there were girls, but they were in the 6th form. And so you arrived and you didn't have any socialization with any females at all. And women were just, wow, they're just like up here, like these sort of completely remote, amazing creatures. And I was in the school choir, and I think as a young man, sort of like my sort of awakening sexuality, I was a treble in the school choir, and there was a sort of a very attractive young girl who I sat next to me every time in the choir, and I could never even say hello to her. I was just so crippled by shame and embarrassment, and I didn't know how to relate to women at all. You know, I knew how to relate to men, and that how to relate to men was like, be a man, all the typical stuff, you know, don't show emotion, don't be sensitive, you're too oversensitive, don't, you know, all the, you know, this is what I hear from many clients, many people that I work with, that sort of sense of sort of toxic masculinity is sort of being the ideal, you know, and and part of me, as I say, I watched all this and sort of rejected it, but yeah,
it's quite a challenge in that environment. To reject things in that environment is quite a challenge because of the pressure that's placed upon conformity and being within the family, and sort of rejecting that is quite a big deal. How did your parents respond to this sort of move towards more rebelliousness and rejecting of that?
Well, I think I was also quite adept at sort of I became quite adept at sort of manipulating and sort of fitting in many ways. I mean, I went to university, I think when I was 18, and I mean, that was when it really, the wheels started to come off the bus, so to speak, because I was away from that environment where you know you have to be somewhere at a certain time, and these are the rules and the regulations and everything, and it's like I was at Bristol University, and it was just like, well, I can do what the hell I want. That was where it really all started to come out, and I managed to sort of keep up appearances, but sort of there were sort of rumors that sort of like reached my parents' ears. I remember my dad taking me out and saying, now, I've had this call from someone saying that, you know, you're using drugs. And to my eternal shame, poor old dad, he's long gone now, but I remember just getting absolute rubbish. How dare they? Who's saying that? You know, completely overreacted to it. But yeah. But so I kept it quite hidden for quite some time. And
many people do. I mean, I think it's a familiar story that sort of yours in terms of the prep school, the boarding school, a very structured and controlled life, and then sent away as an undergraduate, and then just coming apart because you just don't have the relationship skills, the internal emotional skills. You have no insight into yourself, etc., etc. And then being expected to be an adult when you've never been challenged to grow up in the first place, it's a bit unfair, really, to be honest.
Absolutely.
What I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop us for a second, and I want to just check some of the platforms that we're on and see if anybody's made any comments yet, and see if we've got any sort of questions or comments for you. So just bear with me while I do this. I mean, I had to do it on Facebook, but I'm not so good at doing it on the other platforms. Okay, so we do have a question, actually, which we might go into if that's all right, and then we'll come back to your story. So Lorna Bimmy on Facebook has asked, can you be addicted to digital? If so, the world is getting addicted to social media. How does that affect the brain? Do you want to deal with that now or later? Carry on with the narrative. What do you think? Can we be addicted to digital?
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, yes. And what I believe is that the world is accelerating into a much, addiction, and the addictive nature of being human is accelerating. And so, I mean, we've seen, I mean, as technology evolves, so even sort of the ability to create alcohol. So, you know, that we learned how to create alcohol, how to distill malt or whatever, you know, and that technology produced alcohol. Technology enabled us to sort of change a coca leaf into cocaine. And technology is now bringing the addictive experience, making it much, much more readily available. So yes, absolutely. And so gaming in particular, I mean, social media, everything, it's all designed to be addictive. So the way that social media is designed is to mimic a slot machine. So, you know, when you you get this sort of little ding, buzz, 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 or someone likes your post, you get a little buzz, and it's sort of like, oh, yeah, and that is sort of like rewarding. So it's working on the reward system, absolutely. And the games that are being designed for the youth of today, I mean, this is a huge area that even now we're only just starting to look at how to legislate this, because the gaming designers are designing it so that it creates it's designed to keep you engaged, keep I say kids, but there are adults doing it as well, basically engaged as much as possible, so that they're and within that, they're also teaching people to become gamblers as well. So, for instance, you have things like loot boxes and things like that, which teach very young children how to gamble, how to sort of, oh, there's a mystery prize box here. I wonder what's in here. Click on this, click on that. And it's like, oh, maybe I can win this, you know. And so all of that is very much about reward, and they're playing on that rather cynically. It's all sort of designed to sort of like to hook you in and get you keep on playing, and you know, and this is social media.
I mean, one of the things, I mean, I guess one of the questions is, and we're going to come back to your narrative and your story, because it's a really interesting story, and I've heard some more about it. But just staying with this idea of the online world. Obviously, the online world is not going away. And actually, during the coronavirus, the online world has become more important. And in particular as well, it's become very important for people in recovery. So a lot of the recovery groups that exist have just switched over to online platforms and are delivering. Now, there are issues, as you know, there are issues about those online platforms. They don't produce mirror neuron activation, for example, and they tend to be more on the dopamine side of things rather than the bonding chemicals such as oxytocin, etc. So there are problems with it, and particularly in delivery of therapeutic services, there can be some issues around that. And working with trauma online can be more complicated. It can be done, but it's more complicated, etc. But we're not going to get rid of the online world. And I was talking to a consultant. I'm trying to remember his name. He's actually been out to the cabin and done some training with you. And I'm desperately trying to remember his name, but he was on the show. We were just talking about the fact that,
Jameson.
Sorry?
Jameson Wiggins?
Yes, Jameson. Hello, Jameson, if you're listening. It's good to see you. And we're having a good old chat about it and putting the world to rights. And one of the things I think we both agree on is that the online world is not going away. And the online world is shaping what the nature of being a human being is, without being too pompous or up my own arse about it. It is having such a profound impact that it's shaping in similar ways. We both sort of agreed that in similar ways to when we moved from oral to literate culture, with sort of the invention of the printing press and how that shifted human psyche and human personalities. And I think that the online world is having a similar type of impact, and we don't know what it's going to look like yet, obviously, but so it's not going away. And I'm interested in this idea of recovery, and because you talked about recovery as part of it is abstinence, but there are certain forms of recovery, obviously, where abstinence doesn't work. So when you've got food issues and you think of those in addictive terms, you can't be abstinent from food. That's just bonkers, isn't it? Because you're going to be dead. If you've got sex addiction, you can't just be abstinent from sex, because that's not realistic as a human being, and it's an important part of relationships, etc. Same with the online thing. I guess we can't just promote a simplistic abstinence approach. So going back to the question, what do you think are the approaches in terms of looking at online addictions, if they are, and how we sort of deal with them and how we manage them?
Well, I think it's I think, like with anything, that it's not always a one size fits all. So it's very much working with the individual. So it may be that there's just one particular thing that is in the digital world that is that hits the spot for the individual. It might be Fortnite, it might be I don't know, World of Warcraft, or whatever it might be, and you're right, you cannot avoid, you have to use digital in today's world. So it's very much defining what recovery looks like for those people. So I mean, I work with someone, I'm thinking of someone in Asia that I worked with recently, and who struggles. He struggles because he is I think what Jameson calls them digital natives. He's a digital native. That's his.
You and I are. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And his problem, he came to us at the cabin because of gaming addiction, and now he really struggles to function, when he gets near a computer. But it's about, okay, well, we have to define what are the no-go areas and what are the areas. So it's about very much learning how to use technology rather than technology using you. Much the same with sex addiction. Again, it's about defining. So if you think of sex addiction, it's about defining what is acceptable and what isn't. So to you as an individual. So is it paying for sex? Is it looking at pornography, or is it looking at certain types of pornography? I don't know. This is not a moral judgment. This is about what for the individual is acceptable and what isn't. What triggers the addiction? What triggers the reward system? What is it that perhaps you have to avoid? So I know Jameson works with this chap, Camadare, who has this site, Game Quitters, and Cam famously is also in recovery from gaming addiction. But I think he was talking to me not that long ago about playing chess online, but he found that even that he couldn't really sort of handle, because he became,
I can imagine.
became sort of very competitive in that as well. So it's sort of working out with the individual, having the relation as a therapist, having the relationship with the client, with the person, and going, well, what works and what doesn't? Where is it that the dysfunction comes in? And perhaps we do have to see the digital world as a whole, and that yes, we do have our digital selves that live in this world, and where are we functional and where are we dysfunctional?
I mean, one of the things, just from my own recovery and also from my own practice, just think about I tend to think of recovery as we're trying to find a healthy relationship to certain types of things. I mean, in general, we want a healthy relationship, and some of those healthy relationships, like around alcohol, for example, it might be that I don't go anywhere near it. Because there's no way of really managing my relationship to it. Same with other types of substances. But then there are other things where it's possible to manage the relationship, but it's finding that relationship to the thing, to the process, that isn't self-destructive. And like you say, being very pragmatic about, well, what are the triggers that send me into not being able to manage my relationship to this thing? And
so an overeater, it may be about the time of day that you eat, or it might be about snacking. It may be about white flour and white sugar. I mean, it depends. Again, you have to really work with the individual to define exactly what it is. But also, again, I think going back to what we've been discussing as well, also looking at where this has come from, or what it is that they're trying to fix. What is it? Why is it that a youth of today wants to spend 24 hours on Fortnite? That to me, so I mean, I've just literally today I was at a friend's birthday afternoon tea celebration, and a guy was there with his 14-year-old son, and the 14-year-old son is actually extremely good at gaming, and potentially is going to, his father was saying he's going to earn enough money to sort of say, I can stop work very shortly. And but he was telling me about how they had defined his gaming, and he has some days where he's 6 hours a day, some days where he's 4 hours a day, another day where there is no gaming at all. And so and these boundaries are very much in place, and the young guy was he was fine with it, and the father, who is an addict in recovery, was saying very different to me. Very different to my process there, because if it was me, I'd be absolutely, give me the computer, I want to be on it now. But he said he's completely compliant, just puts it down. And I think there's a real difference between a professional gamer, someone who's able to game and basically and be successful at it, as opposed to an addict. And that takes us back to where we were talking about, well, what is this disease of addiction? And there's been brain scans which have shown that gamers, there's a part of the brain which is a professional gamer uses a part of the brain which is different to an addict. So the addict is much more in the limbic system, in the amygdala, and it's hijacking the survival system, whereas the professional gamer is actually in the part of the brain which is more in their prefrontal cortex, where they're able to make the decisions of, now I need to stop, maybe I need to eat, maybe I need to go and
absolutely. And the prefrontal cortex is our executive decision maker. That's the bit that's all the juicy bit, all the stuff that we think is really good about the world, that we're good at. That's where it comes from, is this frontal cortex. And so that's where we always want to be in many ways. And of course, the frontal cortex, in terms of the limbic system, we want strong relationships between the two. Whereas addiction hijacks that and it stops those relationships forming. And I guess that's what we're talking about here, sort of neurological. I just wanted to make a point as we're live, is that we've had this really interesting conversation come from one question. So please do drop your questions in. There are multiple platforms at which you can drop them in. At the moment, because it's the first night for me trying to navigate through all of these platforms, and because I'm not a native digital person, I'm too bloody old to be native in it. I'm still sort of, so I can find the Facebook ones. I can ask my team out there to be looking on LinkedIn for me and looking on Periscope for me, and feeding the questions. Jen, you can message them to me. You know how to get hold of me on WhatsApp. And also you can call and talk to us directly. It'd be really, really great to hear from you directly, anybody who's listening or watching. The number is 07506 319 745. That's +44 if you're calling from outside the UK, +44 7506 319 745. And as you can see, Andy really knows his stuff. So you're going to get some great answers from him. I've just put him on the spot now. He's gone into survival mode. Oh my God, we're going to relapse.
He's calling me an expert. I'm not. I'm a fake. I'm a fraud.
Right. The imposter syndrome emerges.
Yes, exactly.
Lots of identification going on here, as you can see. But yes, he's a good guy. We were sort of we interrupted your life story because I'm really interested in this thing about, you know, how healers come to be. You're a healer, and how we come to be in healing. I mean, I think we share a similar view of what's going on and what makes a good healer. So you were telling us, you got us to the point where the wheels are coming off at university because suddenly you're expected to behave like a grown-up, which was well beyond your capacity at that point. How bloody dare them?
I just want to have fun. Basically, I've been let off the leash. It was just like, wow, God.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's keep going through that story. So people are beginning to notice now that your using is odd. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. But well, what happened was, I mean, I dropped out of university. I dropped out twice. I sort of got involved. I got involved in a relationship that was very addictive, as relationships can be. You know, particularly if you're an addict. So I was sort of trying to. Not only was I fixing myself on drugs, but I was very much fixing myself on this woman, and it was a very obsessive, very intertwined. We both used drugs together. I mean, it was the best of times and the worst of times.
So co-addict, codependent.
Yes, exactly.
Very dark, very dramatic and dark and intense.
Exactly, and very enmeshed. And yeah, and I moved to London with her, and that eventually didn't work out. But I was then in London, and I can't remember, I went through a sort of variety of different jobs I worked in. I sort of didn't really settle. I didn't know what I wanted. I was a bit lost. I sort of worked in restaurants, and then I worked at the Observer newspaper as a salesperson, and then in a publishing company. But all the time, just sort of taking more chemicals daily, always taking something, and that was progressing. And I just felt lost. I'd left. I hadn't finished my degree. I was in London. I didn't have any focus. Didn't know where I was going, and I was miserable. I had this job at the Observer. And I think my job for a while was to look after the West End London estate agents, and my job was to go into West End London estate agents and say, "Give me some space, buy some space in the Observer." And I used to walk into their office and they'd just say, "Get out, go, phone us." But I wasn't allowed to phone them. I was made to go out and talk. Yeah. And I ended up just sitting on the central line, going up and down, so depressed, and just saying, "Oh, I don't know what I want from life." I used to write all this sort of very dark poetry, sort of like lamenting my life. And And I went to see my dad one day and just said, "Dad, I can't stand it." And bless him, he listened to me, and he just said, "Well, find another job before you leave." And I just couldn't. I couldn't bear it. I couldn't stand life, what I was doing. And I sort of, and that was it really. I went from one to another, one job to another, and getting more messy and never really finding myself. And then, that's right. And what happened? I sort of got into sort of clubbing. I got into London's clubland, and of course that got more and more sort of the drugs got more. And I was drawn to a very sort of shallow perception of what perhaps happiness would be. I sort of saw that as sort of, I don't know, the sort of poppy sort of world, like clubland, fame, glamour. I was drawn to that, like a butterfly to a flame, really. And because I thought that's probably where I need to be. I need to be around famous people, glamorous, in the right place. And I ended up working in film and television, and I got a job being Mel of the comedy duos Mel Smith and Griff Rhys-Jones. I got a job as Mel's driver on one of the series of Smith and Jones, and he ended up giving me a job for their company where I worked for the next 10 years. But it was a world in which I was able to have a acceptable drug habit.
Yes, exactly. It facilitated.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So that I was, it wasn't
how
because
odd that we find these jobs, right?
Yes.
How odd that we find jobs. Yeah.
Absolutely. It wasn't that I wanted to make films or television or anything like that. I wasn't sort of like, it was purely this facilitated my using. And I had a very a sort of very open sort of cocaine habit that was acceptable at my work and in that industry.
Yeah.
In fact, can I say this? Yeah, the managing director of where I worked, his PA had a drawer, and you basically in there was like lots of grams of cocaine, and basically you could sign your name and take one out, and it came directly off your salary. So that was the environment in which I worked. So,
right. Okay.
And but on top of that, I then had a secret other habit which balanced out the cocaine addiction as well. So, and it became completely untenable after a while. And I functioned in that world for 10 years. I was actually very good at being a producer. I could produce £1 million TV commercials. I was very organized. I think perhaps that British public school background allowed, and dad's sort of military background gave me that sort of edge of like, right, I can just do this. I think also perhaps the world I came from as well, there's a sense of sort of hypervigilance. I'm sort of quite hypervigilant as a person. I think that anxiety I talked about earlier. And
also you're in survival mode anyway because of the addiction. So you're functioning in the limbic, amygdala, etc. So very much that sort of primitive functioning within the brain.
Yes, and I mustn't make a mistake. I have to get this absolutely right. I need to survive. I need to get my salary so that I can pay for my lifestyle and So constantly hyper alert. Yeah. Very, very stressful looking back on it. And unbelievable. I mean, I managed to last as long as I did, really. And eventually, I think I left before I was pushed, and saying I'm going to go and start my own company, which I did with a couple of friends. But I was unable to function there. I think that
again, that's a very familiar pattern, I think. So if people want to know what the narrative is of a middle-aged addict who gets recovery, this is it. And So initially you can do well, and then the wheels start coming off, and then you set up your own company because you're beginning to reach a point where you can't be employed because for various reasons. So we go and isolate.
Yeah.
We become the boss, and nobody can call us out, and nobody can challenge us in any way.
Yes.
And we can say, oh, well, yes, here I am doing this. Yeah. So very familiar story. So you set up your own company. What sort of age were you around about that time then, do you think?
Must have been in my sort of early 30s, around about sort of 30, 33, something like 33, 34.
And I'm guessing that your private life was sort of either a desert or a war zone. I can't imagine it would be anything else.
It was a war zone. It was alongside all of this. I've been very involved in London's clubland as well. I used to DJ, put clubs on and things like that. So there was an element of like Mr. Bonhomie. I was sort of like, yeah, hail fellow, well met, down the pub on the Portobello Road, yeah, so there was sort of like a sort of social element within my drug taking, but also a sense of being completely isolated. So when I go home, shut the door and be on my own, I found that virtually completely intolerable. I mean, I found that very, very difficult, and I was incapable of having truly intimate relationships. I'd had, that early relationship, that dysfunctional codependent relationship with that girl when I was sort of 18 to 20 or whatever. That was the longest relationship I had in my life up until 7 years ago. So I was, a relationship of 2 years was the longest relationship I had with a woman. I mean, I think that's quite sad, actually, really. I'm not looking for sympathy, but I look back on that person that I was, and I think,
what it sounds like is very lonely. It sounds
was
like a very lonely place to be to me.
There was a sort of a craving inside myself, Noel, for intimacy, a real,
absolutely
gut-wrenching sort of like, I used to say, if I could just find the right woman and just be in this relationship, that will do it, that'll fix it and everything. And it was like, and the more I felt that, the more desperate I was, and the more I was incapable of having a relationship, and it was painful. It was really painful. I'd
like to move us on the narrative, because I'm aware of the time. It's about 10 here, and we're going to finish in 20 minutes. And I want to get into how your rock bottom, and then your recovery, and then what got you into being a clinician, and how you got into this, because I think it's a fascinating story, and I think you've got some really interesting pointers for people around that. So let's move the film. Let's fast forward the film. You have what on the surface looks like a really interesting 30s. You're successful in many ways, but internally you're a disaster zone. You're very lonely. You're craving something. You don't know how to do these things, and gradually, as it always does, the addiction takes over more and begins to destroy your life more, where you go from hanging around with all these fantastic media types and being successful to living in a car on your own, on the edge of destruction, and you end up in a treatment centre. How did that happen? Did you sort of how
did I get to the treatment centre?
Well, I guess, I mean, sort of, how did you? Because
there was, I think it's quite a few. There was a cohort of people that I used with, and some of them started to get clean. I had no idea what that meant. They just disappeared, and one in particular, another Andy, friend of mine, he was a storyboard artist in the film industry, still is, but he got clean before me, and he gave me a telephone. I bumped into him, and he gave me a telephone number for someone at a place called Sharp on the Old Court Road, and I think, and I phoned Sharp. I think I spoke to Dave Mulvaney. I think I spoke to someone at Sharp, and they basically said, "Well, you need funding." So I went to Westminster Council, to their substance abuse team, and in these days, God, was I looked after. Basically, this Westminster substance abuse team paid for me to go to Cloud's house in Wiltshire for 6 weeks. I went from there to Thurston House, which was a secondary facility for men only, in Clapham, for a further 6 months. And then I went into a hostel for the homeless, the Cardinal Hume Centre in Horseferry Road. I went there for another 7 months. And at the end of that, Westminster Council gave me a flat. I mean, God, it's unbelievable. This would not happen today. I mean, they literally put me to the top of the housing list and gave me a flat, a council flat. So I was incredibly blessed. And I think what precipitated that was that I just literally ground to a halt. I could not function. And it was that point of just desperate and reaching out for help and saying, please help me.
But you did reach out for help, which is really well done, because that's where it starts, isn't it?
It is. And to be honest, Noel, because I speak to a lot of people, in my work today, and I'm often doing assessments for clients, and I'm speaking to people who are at that point. And I'm aware of how precious that point is, because actually, if you don't get the client or the patient at that point, they may continue for years more, or they may die. So that's part of what really drives my passion for the work that I do, because I really want to get that person at the right time, because for me, it was the right time. It was absolutely the right time, and I got the help that I needed at that point. If I hadn't, maybe I'd have just carried on until it was game over. But
I mean, I guess one of my passions, because I'm just, if any younger people are listening, I just want to assure you, the right time can start sooner. Believe me, you don't have to wait till you're in your 40s. The right time can be when you choose it, and it can be right now. Make that decision now. But I guess one of my passions and why I have this show and why I go into such depth in people's stories is because I think I was sharing these stories, allowing somebody who hasn't been able to find a place of recovery to understand that it is possible. It introduces something that I think is really, really crucial in all treatment, which is hope. The genuine hope that something can be different, because when you identify with somebody's story, even though you and I are sort of smiling knowingly at each other, it was horrific you're using. It was horrible. And if somebody's in there using now, listening to this, we do understand that it's horrific what you're going through. It isn't fun. We can look back on it and smile, but when you're in it, it's the shittiest thing in the world. And just to know that there is hope out there, and that's why I think it's really, I'm really glad that you're willing to open up in this way, Andy, because I think it saves people's lives when we're able to do this, because it gives people a sense that things can be different.
Well, I feel very emotional talking to you right now, Noel, because it is all about hope. It is, because I was in my own personal hell. It was horrible. It was terrifying. It was miserable. I couldn't see a way out. The only thing I could think of was, oh, maybe I'll just die using. And I hear many people talk like that. And really, the difference today to where I was at, and people in recovery often talk about life beyond your wildest dreams. My life today is just unrecognizable. I have recovered myself. I am in recovery, but I have recovered myself, and it's the most incredible gift. And
I can see it. I mean, I can see it. You're clearly a very different person to that that young man that was unable to cope. So you do this treatment. Again, I just want to make a point here to people that are listening that, I mean, one of the things that your story demonstrates to me is that recovery takes time. and it requires a lot of help. It doesn't necessarily mean, though, folks, if you're listening, that the help you need is exactly what Andy got. That's what worked for him. But it will be, you know, a long-term commitment with help for a long time, and don't be afraid of that. Help is still available, and long-term help is still available as well. Treatment models have changed, but you know, there are people out there, particularly in fellowship, that'll stay with you the rest of your life. So really, don't be worried about that at all.
Absolutely, and just to speak to your point about younger people, I mean, one of the facilities we have at the cabin is sort of like 18 to 26-year-olds, and we have incredible success stories of people who come to us at 7. Well, actually, we had a 17-year-old recently because he was going to have his 18th birthday whilst he was with us. But you know, and people's lives are turned around at that age. Like you said, you absolutely don't have to wait. I think when people are shown what is possible and what they can achieve and how incredible life can be, people grasp it with both hands.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to, before we finish, and then I'm going to get onto your story again about what you did next, the next bit of it. We've got about 10 minutes left. We're actually running out of time. Do you remember when I said to you when we were doing the research call, I said it's not a long time, believe me, 90 minutes is not a long time. You were like, no man, that's really, I'm not sure I've got enough to talk about it. And it's like, here we are, it's almost over, and there's still a huge amount to be talking about. But I just want to quickly check on Facebook to see if anybody's made any more questions or comments, and they want to sort of have some questions answered. So bear with me just 1 second. At the moment, no, we're okay. We've answered all the questions there. So again, to my team, if people are asking questions on other platforms, let me know. And you've got about 10 minutes left before to phone in and talk to us directly. Particularly call if you're struggling. If you are finding that this conversation is making you feel uncomfortable things about yourself and about your using, and you're finding no identification, now is the time to give us a call. We may not be able to deal with you right away, but you know, Andy and I can see you off the call as well and have a chat with you and point you in the right direction. So don't be afraid if you're struggling to have a call. So it's 07506 319 745. That's +44, and drop the first 0 off if you're calling from outside the UK. Now, you got into recovery, you had this fantastic treatment, and you were then raring to go. And then what was next? We're going to have to make this really quick because we've got about 8 minutes left.
Okay, so basically, I wasn't raring to go. I was lost. I was completely lost. I didn't know who I was. I didn't even know what I liked. I didn't. I remember asking a girl at one of the meetings, you know, the 12-step meetings, saying, well, "What should I be wearing?" I didn't even know what to wear because my whole identity had been completely sort of wrapped up in drugs, club culture, or being this sort of grandiose sort of producer, whatever, and I didn't know who I was. So I tried many different things. I thought very early on, I want to help people. One of the things about recovery is very much about learning to be of service. So I knew that I'd taken all my life and I wanted to give back, but I didn't know how I wanted to give back. And the very obvious way was to be a therapist, to be a counsellor, to be a drug counsellor. I said to my sponsor, who's someone who mentors you in the recovery world, I said to him, you know, I'd like to be a counsellor, I think. And he said, Andy, just wait till you're 5 years clean, but actually probably in your case, wait till you're 10 years clean. I think he knew that I was quite damaged, and he was right. He was right, because
I agree. Yeah.
It took me a long, and I went off and I did various. I tried to go back into the film industry. That didn't work because that was all about ego and lack of self-esteem, and it really didn't fit anymore. So I ended up going back to university. I did a degree in English literature and creative writing, loved it, absolutely, it was just the most incredible experience, sitting, listening to these incredibly bright people giving lectures, and I just lapped it up. And the opportunity to read books and study poetry, it was wonderful.
I mean, I think it's important.
Poetry.
There's a really important point in there, which you and I talked about previously, which is there does seem to be nowadays a shortening of the amount of time between people getting into recovery and then thinking that they're going to get a professional qualification in treating people. And I actually find that quite a worrying move. I don't agree with it. I don't think it's a good idea, and I think it sort of is at risk of reducing standards clinically in the industry, to be honest.
Absolutely. Well, I see myself. So it took me, I'd say, over 10 years before I started to train in this area. So, what was I going to say? Damn.
You see yourself as, you started a sentence as you see yourself as, but whatever, it's okay. So, I mean, I know.
Yeah. So no, yeah, sorry, no. Yeah, I see myself as a wounded healer. So
Right.
I see myself as, through everything I've gone through the wounds, of not only the addiction, but the sort of, the childhood developmental trauma, whatever we want to call it, all of that, my pain, everything out of that has come my ability to heal. I think that, the more healing I've done on myself, the more I'm able to work with others. But I think there's a danger, as you say, with people in very early recovery getting into this field, and they perhaps haven't done enough work on themselves. And even myself, in the early days of me working as a counsellor, the dangers of this being a wounded healer is that I actually align myself with the client far too much, and I become their friend, or part of me, the unwell side of myself wants their approval, because I'm part of me sort of very approval seeking. So I become a less effective therapist. But I have awareness around this now because of the work that I've done, the studying, the training, and the supervision I get. So I'm very aware of that. But I think there are many people who, 2 or 3 years into their recovery working in this field, have no awareness of that whatsoever.
And also no life experience. And I think that's one of the things, because I think good psychotherapy training has age bars. It says you can't train under a certain age because you just won't have experienced life enough to possibly be sitting with somebody and being a therapist for them. I mean, it's sort of, if I make an extreme example, which makes the point, we wouldn't assume a 12-year-old could be a good psychotherapist. Everybody would go, well, they're not developmentally there yet, aren't they? But, in addiction, in a sense, what addiction does is it distorts development and forces it down a very narrow track, but it stops the broad whole human development. And I think when people come into recovery, what's offered to them, what it was offered to me, was this opportunity to go and do that development in a very held, loving environment, which is called recovery and fellowship and all that sort of stuff, where you get to be an idiot, make all those mistakes that you avoided because you were too terrified previously, and you just do, and you grow and you become a much more rounded human being. And I think that as a healer, I think that is important, that the people's life experience are available as healers. And I get what you're saying about the wounded healer. It's a very seductive place if you're not thoughtful about it. It can become something that you become enmeshed in the way that we became enmeshed in other relationships, and it's sort of a very narcissistic, if you like, relationship to self.
Absolutely. No, a supervisor told me to read a book called The Codependent Counsellor, which was an excellent.
Oh, wow.
Have you ever come across that?
That's a fantastic title. Absolutely.
Yeah,
brilliant.
And it's a great book. And when I was studying my master's, it was sort of that was integral to writing about what it was like to be a wounded healer, because I have been and can be a very codependent counsellor, where it's so my passion that I've talked about in this talk today. The danger is it can tip into wanting to rescue, to fix, You know, that is part of my wound. That comes, it's like, I think Winnicott talks about sitting on his sort of mother's lap, and it was from there that his sort of desire to sort of heal came from. And it's very similar with myself. It's that desire to fix, to heal, and if that's too prominent, I'm doing the client a disservice. But I really have to have that awareness around what it means to be a wounded healer. And I think a lot of people that work in this field of addiction there's a lot of recovering addicts that do end up working in the field. And there again, so the importance of supervision is essential. So someone to reflect back to you and, you know.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. But I also think there's a lot of people nowadays, I'm coming across it more and more, who don't even bother getting qualifications and then start calling themselves some sort of healer of some sort in the addiction world. So I sort of despair of all of that, to be honest. And but that's for another show. We are actually sort of out of time, and in some ways, I'm you know, in some ways we're at the beginning of the conversation. That we've just got to know you a little bit, and this is where the really interesting stuff is beginning to happen. And you know, I wanted to go into that conversation about Winnicott, who happens to be somebody that, you know, I have a lot of time for, although he's very out of date. But I think a lot of the ideas that he has are sort of amazing. And I'm wondering if this is a big ask. Don't answer this question yet, but whether you want to come back at some other point and we start the conversation here, because we've got to know you and begin to talk about some of these really important issues in the mental health and addiction world, issues around the dumbing down of our profession that is going on at the moment. And actually, Dame Black, who recently produced a report on, I'll send it to you, Andy.
Okay.
A report on addiction treatment in the UK, specifically mentioned it. That this is what's happening, and it's a real problem in addiction treatment at the moment. That as people move in who have no qualifications or very few qualifications and no accountability, etc. So that would be an interesting conversation to have as a follow-up, I think.
Yes, absolutely. I'd be very interested in that, in continuing that.
Great.
I think because also there's a context with what's happened in Asia in the 10 years that I've been in Asia as well.
Yes, I'm sure there is. I'm sure there's lots, because you know, I think I know what the context is, having sort of talked to various people. But I'd really enjoy if you came back and we had another conversation about this. I've been having this conversation with other providers around the world as well. So I was talking to the COO of Northbound, which is over in California, and again talking about these issues that I think that as professionals in the field, we need to be really addressing. You know, if you think about somewhere like California, 80% of the treatment centres there refuse to do medically assisted detox. And I'm like, how can you do that? You know, we know exactly. They had to produce special legislation in California to force them to offer it. Because people were setting up these treatment services that were based upon ideological and philosophical lines, which said, no, you can't use medication, and putting people's lives at risk. So, I mean, I think there are these bigger, broader issues that I'd like to, you know, engage with in conversation with, because I think you'd have some amazing insights to share with people. We are out of time now, unfortunately. And it's just been amazing to have you on.
Oh, thank you so much.
Really?
No, it's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed it, actually, and I'm a bit sad it's coming to an end. I thought, oh, I'm just getting going. Come on, let's open up now.
I told you that's what it would be like. You were like, no, an hour and a half. I can't do that. I won't survive. But it's been wonderful to have you on. You're such a warm and open guy. And lots of identification. I feel very sort of emotionally connected to you and your story, even though you're billion miles around the earth at the moment.
Even though the mirror neurons aren't up and running.
Yeah, but it's interesting, that one, isn't it? You know.
Yes.
Go figure. Apparently it does get up and running once you've met. If you've met once, real world.
Right.
And then you do something about the neurons fire. But when you only have online, again, Wiggins. Bradley. No, that's ridiculous.
Bradley Wiggins, the cyclist.
I kept calling him Bradley. It's ridiculous. It's not. Jameson. How could I forget Jameson, an Irishman like me? But anyway, it'd be lovely to get you back on. We do have to finish there. Folks, thanks for joining us. Thanks for the questions and comments. We will trawl through the various platforms that we've been on, and if more questions and comments go. I'll feed them through to Andy. You might want to follow through on them. But for now, I'm going to say goodbye to Andy Leach from the cabin out there. And thank you so much for joining us. James, I think we finished, so turn us off and see you all next week, I hope.
Great. Thanks so much.